so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to my November wrap-up. Today I'm going to be talking about all the books that I read during the month of November. So November was an alright reading month. November was non-fiction November, so I read quite a lot of non-fiction this month. Well, quite a lot for me. This month I read 9 books. Well, I finished 9 books, but 3 of them I had started before. One of them I only read a little bit of this month. And then I also started one other book as well, which I'll talk about too. So I have 10 books to talk to you about today, 5 of which are non-fiction and 5 of which are fiction, which I'm quite pleased with. There were a lot of books that I spoke about in my non-fiction November TBR that I didn't get around to picking up during the month of November, partly because I finished the 3 books I was intending on finishing, but then I also read entirely one book that I wasn't planning on reading entirely. So I was planning on doing a lot more like dipping in and out of stuff in non-fiction November, which I didn't do in the end because I was so enjoying the books I was reading. So usually I start my wrap-ups with the classics, but today I think I'm going to start off with the non-fiction reads instead, as it was non-fiction November. But I will start off with the classic non-fictions for consistency's sake. I did indeed manage to finish the 2 Victorian non-fiction books that I had started in Victober and hadn't got very far through. The first of which was The Life of Charlotte Bronte by Elizabeth Gaskell. I absolutely loved The Life of Charlotte Bronte. I really thoroughly enjoyed this one. It is a biography of Charlotte Bronte, who is one of my favourite authors, written by Elizabeth Gaskell, who is another of my favourite authors. So of course I was going to really enjoy it. Saying that, it wasn't actually at all what I expected. It is a biography, but to be honest it's more of a collection of letters with commentary. Like, I would say 2/3 of the book are letters from Charlotte Bronte to other people, which Gaskell writes out and comments either side, adds details about Charlotte Bronte's life that she knew, but a lot of the book is letters, which actually I really enjoyed. One thing I will say is I read this on Kindle. Don't read it on Kindle. If you're going to read it, get yourself a physical edition that has notes, because there are some of the letters which are in French, which hopefully a print edition would translate. It was just incredibly emotionally engaging and just utterly moving. And I do think that I got from this book such a sense of Charlotte Bronte's character. I don't know how accurate it is. I would like to read a modern biography of Charlotte Bronte, and I would like to read, to be honest, a modern biography of the whole Bronte family, because one thing I did find in this is that Charlotte Bronte emerges as a kind of full character, and Emily and Anne are both quite shadowy. And I knew, of course, that Charlotte Bronte outlived her 2 sisters and her brother Branwell, and I did also know that she had 2 sisters who also died when they were children, but I don't think I'd ever really fully appreciated the emotional impact of the fact that she lost 5 siblings over her life, and some bits in this book just made me sob. Like the whole last third of the book, I was just in tears all the time, which is a problem because I do all of my reading on my commute. But anyway, I want to talk about 4 things that really made me smile in this book, and also one thing that just made me cry even more than all of the rest. Of the things that made me smile, there's a letter from the stationer who worked in the village where the Brontes lived to Elizabeth Gaskell, saying that the Bronte sisters always used to come to his shop and buy tons and tons of paper, and he was always a bit confused about how they could possibly get through so much paper, but he knew that they were always really upset whenever he sold out of paper. So whenever he had run out of paper, he'd get really worried that the Miss Brontes were going to come, because he knew how sad they would be, and I just thought that was such a lovely small detail. I also loved hearing about various inspirations in Charlotte's life for her books. It made me smile so much that Charlotte Bronte told Gaskell that Shirley in Shirley is based on Emily Bronte. So the 3 clergymen, the 3 curates in Shirley were based on 3 real people, and the 3 real people found out this later on in life, and they recognised themselves in this book. And apparently at first they were all a little bit outraged, but then they started to really enjoy that they were in a book, and they started to call each other by the names that Charlotte Bronte had given them in the book instead, which I just found really funny. And another thing I loved is that there are letters in this book that are conversations between Gaskell and Bronte, in which you get such a sense of their friendship. There's a letter in here in which Charlotte Bronte is advising Gaskell on the ending of Ruth, and that just blew my mind that exists. But I also wanted to mention the thing that made me cry. She's in correspondence with another writer who is advising her on something about her books, and this is after Emily and Anne's death, and she says, "The 2 human beings who understood me and whom I understood are gone. I have some that love me yet, and whom I love without expecting or having a right to expect that they shall perfectly understand me. I am satisfied, but I must have my own way in the matter of writing. 2 human beings who understood me and whom I understood are gone." I sobbed on the train a lot. And then I also finished The Uncommercial Traveller by Charles Dickens. This is a book of journalism, I suppose, and kind of essays and reflections by Charles Dickens. It's one of his non-fiction books. I have to confess that I didn't love this. I did enjoy some of it, but for me Dickens's non-fiction is not a patch on his fiction, and I think it's because it just hasn't aged well. For me, Charles Dickens's books, they're not timeless, obviously, they're so completely Victorian, but I can understand everything, and even if there are small references that I miss, it doesn't impact on the meaning. But his non-fiction, especially because a lot of the kind of chapters and reflections in The Uncommercial Traveller are quite, like, satirical, a lot of them just go completely over my head and I just don't understand what he's talking about. There were some that I absolutely loved in this and that I really, really appreciated. There's one chapter called Dullborough where Charles Dickens talks about going back to the town in which he grew up and how things have changed and things have stayed the same. I really enjoyed, there was one essay where he talks about being in London in the summer when everyone's away on holiday and how London is very, very different, and how all the servants, while their masters are away on holiday, are like really, really enjoying themselves. There were some that I really enjoyed, but there were also some that I just didn't understand and that just went completely over my head. I enjoyed Dickens's writing as always, but there would be paragraphs and paragraphs where he just lost me. Dickens' novels are like my favourite thing ever, but his non-novel stuff is much less my cup of tea. To be honest, if it wasn't by Dickens, I might have DNF'd it, but it was Dickens and I owed it to my great respect and love for Dickens, so I did finish it. But anyway, I am glad I finally read it. Then on to some more modern non-fiction. This month I listened to an audiobook, How Not to Be a Boy by Robert Webb. This is a memoir by Robert Webb, who is a comedian, and this memoir of Robert Webb's, How Not to Be a Boy, is specifically focused on kind of gender and his experience of gender identity growing up as a boy in the 70s and 80s, I suppose. I absolutely loved the reading experience of this. It's really, really enjoyable. It's hilarious, but also it's incredibly moving. Robert Webb lost his mother as a teenager, and like the way he writes about that kind of stuff is just heartbreaking to read and incredibly well written. But I do have a few like structural complaints about it. I don't know. I felt like it should have been twice the length and dealt with twice the period of time, because he mostly talks about his childhood and his sort of teenage and university years from when he's like 3 to when he's about 21. That is, I would say, 3/4 of the book, or possibly slightly more. And then he talks a little bit about being an adult, but not very much. And actually, I feel like he should have talked about being an adult a lot more. And I can kind of understand why he might not want to talk as much about his wife and his children and his relationship with them. I can kind of understand that from like a personal perspective. But also, he talks a bit about being married and being a father and how he hasn't always pulled his weight and how that is gendered. And he talks a little bit about this, but not very much. And actually, that would have been one of the most interesting things in the book, and I wish he had talked about it much more. And I think the book could have been twice as long and dealt with the second 20 years of his life as well as the first 20 years of his life, and I think it would have been much better for that. I still really enjoyed it. I would still highly, highly recommend it, but I feel like there were more interesting observations to be made in terms of gender as an adult than as a child, partly because I think the gendering of children is something we are more aware of than how that continues into adulthood, where you're aware of it but you're also not aware of everything. I don't know, like I said, I still really, really enjoyed it, but I really feel that it should have been twice as long. And then I read The Victorian House by Judith Flanders, which I really enjoyed, as you can tell by all of the post-it notes. So I was intending to start this in Non-Fiction November, but I was not intending to finish this. I didn't think I would finish it. I thought I would start it and not get on because it's quite long, and I know that non-fiction is not always the easiest for me, but I was just enjoying it so much and finding it so engaging and so fascinating that I just decided to read it all in 1 month and really, really loved it. I found it so fascinating, so useful, so interesting, and just really engaging and enjoyable as well. It is, as it says on the tin, a history of the Victorian house. It is a social history as well. It talks a lot about the culture and sort of social rules surrounding the household, and also the place of women within Victorian society, because that often was the home and how that affected them. It's ordered by rooms, so the first chapter is the bedroom, then the nursery, the kitchen, the scullery, etc. And we kind of move around a Victorian house, find out about the things within each room, the function they play, how that affects sort of everyday life, and so on. And it's really, really interesting. It's really, really enjoyable, and I really, really loved it. Saying that, considering how much I loved it, I did have a few issues with it. It's mostly, at times, almost exclusively focused on urban middle class Victorian homes and urban middle class Victorian life. And I appreciate that that is a significant proportion of people during the Victorian period, and also that the middle class was often the ideal within Victorian period. So the kind of Victorian urban middle class house was in a way kind of the ideal house of the Victorian period. But actually I really would have liked her to address how houses differed along the social scale and also in different parts of the country. The middle class clerk's house in London is very different to the cottage of a farmer in the countryside, is very different to the home of a working class man in Manchester. I really wish that had been addressed a bit more in here. And she occasionally talks a little bit about sort of different social customs along sort of different class backgrounds, but not really very much for me in a book that's this long and for the most part is that in depth. And I really would have liked that to be a bigger part of the book. And another thing I thought was that her structure of having it sort of room by room was really nice, but she doesn't always stick to it very well, and there are a few chapters where she doesn't actually talk about the room she's supposedly talking about. Like in the chapter The Scullery, she talks about the servants, and she doesn't really talk about the scullery. And I know it's related, but it felt a bit, I don't know, it didn't feel quite right. In the chapter called The Parlour, she talks mostly about like weddings and marriage, but she doesn't actually tell me, no one has told me yet what the difference between a parlour and a morning room and a sitting room is, and no one will tell me. Like, I really want to know. It's actually, although everything that's in here is very interesting, sometimes the basic logistics of what different rooms are wasn't there as much as I thought it would be. So I really enjoyed this. I just had a few issues with that, but I would highly recommend it because I think it's very interesting for what it is. I just wish it had been something a tiny bit different. And then the fifth non-fiction book I read this month, I didn't finish, I just started as I was intending. I knew I wasn't going to finish it this month, and that is The English and Their History by Robert Tomes. This is an audiobook. I've got about 10 hours in, maybe. I'm about a quarter of the way through, less than a quarter of the way through. It's 45 hours, which is why I knew I was not going to finish it in a month. But it is a history of England and Englishness as far back as you can kind of go to the present day. So I think I'm just approaching the Tudor period at the part where I'm at now, and I'm really enjoying it. I'm finding it really interesting. Partly because so far the period of time we've been exploring is a period of time I don't know much about at all, which has been really nice. And also because I really like the way that he explores both the political history but also kind of social and especially cultural history. He talks a lot about national identity, what it meant to be English. He talks a lot about how the language English changed and evolved, which I found especially interesting. Some bits I did find a bit too political for me. Some of the stuff in the medieval period, it does feel like a list of names and events rather than exploration of them, but for the most part I think the balance is quite good, and I do really love it where he addresses the kind of cultural issues of the time and what it means to be English, where he talks about national identity and the formation of a national identity, I suppose. I'm finding it a really interesting history book. I know it's going to take me a while to get through, but I think it will be really rewarding, especially because I'm already like joining up things I knew about in history and working out where all of the Shakespeare history plays, which I know so well, actually fit into history. I'm really enjoying it. I would highly recommend it. I'm looking forward to getting on with the rest. I think I'll probably finish it in like February, but yeah, definitely an enjoyable read. And now onto the 5 fiction books that I finished in the month of November. To start off with the classics, one Victorian book that I finished in the month of November was this, which is Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens. I feel cheating to include this in a wrap-up because I read like 10 chapters this month, and I have been rereading this over the last 18 months as part of my serialised Victorian style Dickens read-along, where I read this along as the Victorians would have done at the time, 3 or 4 chapters every month. Feels really weird to have finished this after I've been rereading it for the last 18 months, which is very long. I love this, obviously, it's my favourite book of all time. I both loved and hated reading it serially. Mostly loved, but it was weird. I am going to make a video in the next couple of weeks about serialisation and books and about reading serially. On the one hand, I got so much more out of like the language of this book than I think I have done on my previous reads. I think this is my 5th or 6th read, and I noticed so many more of the little details, but also it was a very different reading experience, and I wasn't necessarily as engaged or as driven to like pick it up as I would be if I was reading it through all in one go. I don't have much more to say about this book except that I love it. It follows a fortune and what happens after the beneficiary of that fortune is found drowned, and all of the people surrounding that fortune and what happens. It's a book about the Thames and about love and about class and about London in the mid-Victorian period and about social problems and about crime and gender and money and how money can be a corrupting influence and like so many good things. I love it very much, and it's been a joy and a slight pain to do the read along. I might do another Dickens serialised read along because it was quite fun despite also being odd. But yes, I'll talk about this more in my video on serialised reading, which will be up in the next few weeks. Then this month I also read Alice Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll, which I listened to on audiobook. I really enjoyed it. It's so weird. I read Alice's Adventures in Wonderland quite a few years ago now and really enjoyed that, so I thought it was about time that I read Alice Through the Looking Glass. It's just very odd because it's just dream sequence nonsense and fairy tales. I quite like the bizarreness of it. Alice climbs through a looking glass and finds chess pieces that turn into people and Humpty Dumpty and Tweedledum and Tweedledee, and she is a pawn in a chess game and tries to get to the end of the board to become a queen. All quite weird, but quite enjoyable, and that's most of what I have to say on that one. Then also finished The Valley of Fear by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, which is one of the Sherlock Holmes novels. This is the last novel. I think I've got 2 short story collections left to read now, and then I'll have read all of Sherlock Holmes. I didn't love this, to be honest. Me and Nick listened to this together on audiobook. We've been listening our way through the completed works of Sherlock Holmes. I love Sherlock Holmes short story collections. I don't really love the novels. I enjoy The Hound of the Baskervilles, but the other 3 novels I haven't been especially fussed by. Valley of Fear starts off with Sherlock Holmes and Watson in London. They travel outside of London to attend the murder of a particular man, and then they go about solving the case and finding out what happened. That's the first half of the book. In the second half, we flash back to the past in America and find out how the various characters who are involved in the murder case got up to that point. It has a similar structure to The Study in Scarlet, which I also didn't love especially. I find that structure quite weird, and I don't find it very effective, and I don't find it very satisfying. I enjoyed both parts, but I didn't feel like they hung together, and I just didn't love it very much. I think part of the reason as well why I love the short stories so much more than the books is because Sherlock Holmes mysteries are those kind of mysteries where there's just no way as a reader that you're ever going to piece things together and find out, because you never have all of the information. You never have as much information as Sherlock Holmes does. But in a short story format, that never annoys me, and I don't find it irritating at all because it's only short, so it's still really satisfying. But in the novels, I tend to not find them satisfying. I tend to find them a bit weird. Basically, I love Sherlock Holmes short stories, but the novels I'm not fussed by. Didn't really like The Valley of Fear very much, but I have just started listening to the next short story collection in the series, which I am really enjoying, so I'm sure I'll be talking about that at the end of December. But from a mystery that I didn't love onto a mystery that I absolutely did love, next I read Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie, which I adored. I read this partly because I wanted to go and see the film, and partly because I buddy read it with Carolyn from Carolyn's Reading Rambles and Kate Howe. I had a quite weird reading experience reading this. I had a very bad cold during the middle of this month and was off sick for a day and a half. There are not very many books that I could concentrate on if I'm not feeling very well, but Agatha Christie is so easy for me. She's so simple, she's so dialogue heavy, which I love, and she's so straightforward and enjoyable. So I just read it in one day, sat on the sofa with a blanket, and it was a really nice reading experience, and I think it made me feel better. This is only my 3rd Agatha Christie, but I've loved the 3 I've read by her so far, and this one much more than the other 2. So Murder on the Orient Express, I feel like the title tells you pretty much what happens. There is a murder on the Orient Express. Poirot tries to solve it. I thought the solution was so good, so good. One of those perfect solutions where you don't see it coming, but the moment you work out what's going on, it seems so obvious and so perfect for everything that's happening. I think the characterisation is very good. I love the way Christie very quickly draws characters, and I love also how we get such a clear sense of how Poirot works everything out, which is something I do sometimes feel is missing from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Holmes books. Yeah, I absolutely loved it. I'm really hoping to read more Agatha Christie in the future. I think me and Carolyn and Kate might buddy read some others. I just have one last book to talk about, which conversely is the first one I read this month, but was a really brilliant one, and one of my favourite books of the year so far actually, and that is The Girl with the Pearl Earring by Tracy Chevalier. This is quite a famous book, and one that I've been meaning to read for quite a long time. I haven't read any Tracy Chevalier before, but I will definitely be reading more in the future because I love this so much. The book is inspired by this very famous painting, which I believe is just called Girl with the Pearl Earring, and the book follows this girl in this painting in Netherlands in the 1660s. She goes to work as a maid at this artist's house. The story goes on, it ends up with the artist painting her, and it's partly about her relationship with the artist, but also about her position within the family, about her social position, about her family at home, and how they feel about the fact that she's going out to be a maid. I don't want to say it was perfect, that sounds like too high praise, but there were moments in this book where she could have made choices that would have annoyed me, but she didn't, and therefore I loved it like even more because it felt so very much exactly what I wanted. And I loved it so much. I loved her writing. Like, I'm really looking forward to reading more by her in the future because I loved the writing so much. I thought she conjured up the historical setting so well. It's not a historical period I knew anything about, which maybe made me enjoy it slightly more. I don't know, because I feel like when I read historical fiction set in the Victorian period, I'm always looking for mistakes, whereas I don't know anything about Holland in the 1660s. It all felt very real, so I'm kind of satisfied. And I just thought the characterisation was done so well, the character relationships were so perfect, the writing was brilliant, the plot, the pacing was amazing, and I flew through it and I absolutely loved it. This is one of my favourite books of the year so far, and I'm really excited to read some more by her. I do believe she has a book or two set in or just after the Victorian period, so I'm especially looking forward to them, and we'll see if I'm more critical of the history of that. But I love this very, very much. I can't recommend it enough. I know it's a fairly old book that like everyone's heard of by now, but it was amazing. So yes, those are all the books that I read during the month of November. I'm fairly happy with that. I read some good books, even though I feel like I didn't spend as much time reading as I wanted to. Anyway, I hope you have enjoyed this video. Please do let me know in the comments if you've read any of these books and if you enjoyed them, and also if you are participating in Non-Fiction November and if you read any particularly great non-fiction books. I really enjoyed doing Non-Fiction November actually, and it has pushed me to read more non-fiction in the future. So yes, thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.